He was not the loudest man in the room. He never had to be. Long before his name became a whispered warning in alleyways and a headline crafted in fear, Charles Lucky Luciano understood a truth lost on most men who chased power. The real architects of history rarely shout. They calculate. They reshape the world quietly, brick by brick, until one day people wake up and realize everything around them has changed. Luciano was that kind of architect, not of cities or monuments but of an empire built from the shadows. And he did it without the theatrics, the rage, or the blood-soaked bravado that defined the Mafia before him. The myth always begins with the boy, a Sicilian immigrant stepping onto the rough edges of New York City's Lower East Side, facing a world that did not recognize him, respect him, or even pronounce his name correctly. Poverty carved out his reality, survival shaped his instincts. Yet among the chaos, the scraps of street life, the violence of desperate boys looking for a place to belong, there grew inside Luciano an unusual clarity. While others fought to control a block, he studied how to control the city. He saw patterns where others saw obstacles, opportunities where others saw danger. What separated him from the average gangster wasn't fearlessness, it was foresight. Before Luciano, the Mafia in America was an unruly beast, tribal, fragmented, and addicted to its own traditions. Men killed for honor, for territory, for pride. Battles erupted not because they were strategic, but because someone felt slighted, insulted, or disrespected. The old world bosses operated on emotion, on history, and on an outdated code that didn't fit the rapidly evolving American underworld. It was a system destined to collapse under the weight of its own chaos. Luciano didn't want to tear it down, he wanted to redesign it. Not with bloodshed, though bloodshed came, but with structure, diplomacy, and an almost corporate sense of efficiency. And that is where the intrigue begins. How did a quiet young immigrant with no formal education and no legitimate mentors develop the mentality of a modern CEO decades before the term even existed? How did a man raised in a culture of vendettas become the one who ended them? How did someone who rarely raised his voice manage to silence rooms full of killers? Luciano understood something fundamental about human nature. Loyalty is predictable, but ambition is universal. He saw that every gangster wanted the same things: money, power, security, respect. And he realized that the Mafia would only survive if those desires were aligned, not competing. So he did what no one before him dared to do. He stripped the Mafia of its emotional baggage. Gone were the ancient Sicilian feuds, the blind obedience to tradition, the petty power struggles that drained resources and invited police attention. In their place, he created a system, a true organization, one that rewarded strategy over impulse, intellect over intimidation. He formed the Commission, a governing body that looked more like a corporate boardroom than a criminal cabal. He divided territories, standardized rules, and established conflict resolution protocols that replaced bullets with negotiation. It was a reinvention so radical that for years, many refused to believe it was possible. Yet Luciano didn't argue, threaten, or grandstand. He let results speak for him. And when the system began generating money at a scale previously unimaginable, everyone listened. But beneath this transformation lies the emotional hook. The reason his story endures long after the streets he once ruled have been repaved, renamed, and reimagined. Luciano was not just a criminal mastermind. He was a mirror reflecting the American dream's darkest truths. He arrived in the United States chasing opportunity, only to find doors closed, laws stacked, and poverty waiting. He did not become a criminal because he sought violence but because he sought mobility, a chance to rise above a society that refused to see him. His ascent forces us to confront a difficult reality. The same qualities celebrated in America's greatest innovators, ambition, ingenuity, adaptability, were alive in Luciano. He simply applied them where society never intended them to be used. And that is why he fascinates us still. He embodies contradiction. The Mafia, an institution born from blood and fear, was reshaped by a man who preferred conversation over carnage, organization over chaos, order over rage. He was both villain and visionary, a criminal who brought discipline to disorder, a leader who forged unity among men famous for killing each other. Luciano's power didn't come from violence. It came from understanding that violence was inefficient. His dominance came not from intimidation but from intelligence. This is the story of how a quiet immigrant kid engineered a revolution. Not loud, not dramatic, but deliberate. One that outlived him, outgrew him, and ultimately defined the underworld of the 20th century. A man born with nothing became a myth known everywhere. And he did it not by shouting but by thinking. He was, in every sense, a new kind of criminal. Before the rise of Lucky Luciano, the American underworld was not an empire. It was a battlefield, loud, chaotic, and splintered into fragments of old-world loyalty and new-world desperation. In the early 20th century, crime in America did not move with strategy or cooperation. It lurched forward on the fumes of resentment, ethnic rivalry, and personal vendettas that stretched back generations. The Mafia had crossed the ocean, but it had not yet crossed into modernity. It behaved like a relic clinging to tradition in a rapidly changing nation. The criminal landscape of New York City, the eventual capital of Luciano's empire, was a labyrinth of competing cultures and clashing ambitions. Italians, Irish, Jews, Poles, Greeks, and countless other immigrant groups carved out pockets of influence in overcrowded neighborhoods. But influence did not translate to order. Instead, each group fought to the last breath for control of gambling dens, brothels, protection rackets, and street corners that barely yielded enough profit to justify the blood spilled over them. These were not grand criminal enterprises. They were survival operations run by men with more pride than vision. Among the Italians alone, the divisions were staggering. Sicily, Calabria, Naples, regions united by geography but separated by distrust, brought their rivalries with them to America. Neighborhoods became micro-kingdoms, each ruled by a self-declared boss who answered to no one but his own ego. Men spoke of omerta but rarely followed it. Honor was invoked when convenient and ignored when inconvenient. If an insult occurred, violence followed. If territory was threatened, violence followed. If a man simply wished to prove he mattered, violence followed. Predictability did not exist. Cooperation was a fantasy. At the center of this fracturing stood the two dominant Italian criminal factions of the era: the Morello crime family rooted in the Sicilian tradition and the Camorra groups from Naples. Their conflict was the very definition of old-world thinking transplanted into new-world opportunity, grudges mixed with ambition, pride tangled with business. The Mafia-Camorra War of the 1910s was not a war in any strategic sense. It was a stubborn, bloody tug-of-war between men who would rather lose money than lose face. Scores were settled not with negotiation but with bullets delivered in broad daylight. Police corruption, though rampant, could not mask the sheer chaos. Bodies piled up and profits remained stagnant. The irony was unmistakable. America was a land of booming innovation. Skyscrapers rising higher each year, factories multiplying, new technologies redefining daily life. But its criminal organizations were stuck in the 19th century, operating like feudal clans rather than functional enterprises. Their leaders clung to the past, worshipping rituals that had little place in a world driven by rapid expansion and opportunity. In an era when business titans were building national networks of commerce, the Mafia could barely manage a unified neighborhood. Compounding the dysfunction were the ferocious ethnic rivalries that turned every street into contested territory. Irish mobs dominated political machines and labor rackets. Jewish gangs excelled in bootlegging and numbers games. Italians fought viciously among themselves even before they fought anyone else. Alliances were temporary at best and impossible at worst. Distrust flowed thicker than money. No one shared information, resources, or strategies. The idea of collaboration, much less a coordinated national crime syndicate, would have been laughed out of the room. And then came Prohibition. In 1920, when the government banned alcohol, the criminal underworld suddenly found itself sitting atop a gold mine. Bootlegging created more money, more opportunity, and more temptation than any previous racket. But instead of ushering in a golden age of organized crime, it exposed just how unorganized crime truly was. Gangs scrambled to claim routes, breweries, and distribution networks, but none had the infrastructure or leadership to control their markets. Trucks were hijacked by rivals, shipments lost, payments intercepted, bribes duplicated, deals undone. Profits were astronomical, but so were the risks, and the bodies. What could have been an era of structured criminal enterprise became instead a blood-soaked scramble. Leaders grew paranoid, lieutenants grew ambitious, and alliances, already fragile, shattered under the weight of greed. The Castellamarese War, ignited in the early 1930s, would become the most violent illustration of this dysfunction. The conflict between Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano was not a battle for progress but a desperate struggle for control within a system collapsing under its own traditions. Each man claimed to represent order, each delivered destruction. Their soldiers died in the streets while profits leaked into the pockets of more efficient, less traditional rivals. What made these years particularly unsustainable was the lack of a central authority. No organization existed to mediate disputes, standardize rules, or punish rogue actors. Power vacuums emerged constantly, creating cycles of retaliation that consumed resources and terrified communities. Without structure, men relied on intuition and violence, two tools that lost effectiveness as bootlegging expanded into a nationwide operation. Other criminal groups saw opportunities and moved quickly, often outpacing the Italians who remained mired in old grudges. New York, the epicenter of these conflicts, reflected the tension between two worlds. On one side stood the old Mafia, steeped in Sicilian codes, rigid hierarchy, and ritual. On the other stood the emerging American landscape, fast, pragmatic, competitive. Immigrant gangsters were torn between honoring their heritage and adapting to their new environment. Many chose heritage, even as it dragged them toward irrelevance. They could not see that survival demanded evolution. The criminal world before Lucky Luciano was therefore not just violent, it was fundamentally inefficient. Money flowed in torrents, but it pooled unevenly. Men killed for titles that meant nothing outside their immediate circles. Opportunities were squandered because no one could unify operations. Every faction believed it could dominate alone, unaware that the future belonged to those who understood cooperation, not conquest. A seismic shift was not merely possible, it was inevitable. The old guard operated like kings without kingdoms, bound to traditions that stifled progress. The landscape was ripe for someone with vision, someone who saw beyond street corners and vendettas, someone who recognized that the greatest power lay not in spilling blood but in controlling the flow of business. The world before Luciano was a world waiting for a revolution it did not yet know it needed. It was a landscape begging for structure, for diplomacy, for a mind capable of cutting through the noise and chaos. Before Lucky Luciano, crime in America was a storm, roaring, relentless, without direction. What followed would be the calm of strategy, the rise of order, and the birth of a syndicate unlike anything the world had seen. Lucania, a boy pressed into the harsh reality of New York's Lower East Side. The slums did not offer opportunities, they demanded instincts. For most immigrant families, America was a promise. For the Lucanias, newly arrived from Sicily, it was a tightrope walk over poverty. Their tenement was cramped, loud, and unforgiving, a place where every day felt like a test of endurance. Salvatore grew up surrounded by noise, babies crying, neighbors arguing, the thud of footsteps in crowded hallways. Yet it was the silence inside him that shaped his character. He absorbed everything: anger, fear, hope, rivalry. Poverty didn't just harden him, it sharpened him. He saw early on that survival depended not just on strength but on reading people, anticipating danger, and finding angles others missed. The Lower East Side was a cultural collision of Italians, Jews, Irish, Russians, and Poles, a mosaic of identities constantly grinding against each other. Children learned to defend themselves before they learned their alphabets. School offered little meaning when your family needed money more than education. In this environment, gangs didn't symbolize rebellion, they symbolized belonging. Luciano's first brush with gang life came the way it came to most boys in the neighborhood, through violence. A group of older boys beat him and robbed him. He returned home bruised, humiliated, and changed. That beating didn't frighten him, it awakened him. He realized that weakness invited exploitation. If he wanted space in this world, he would have to seize it. Not through raw aggression but through calculated presence. He began running errands for street gangs, carrying messages, watching corners, learning how the underworld breathed. He saw who controlled which blocks, who feared whom, and who paid for protection. These early tasks weren't glamorous, but they gave him access to information, the most valuable currency in the slums. Luciano understood something other boys didn't. Power starts with understanding the system from the bottom. His parents hoped for a clean future for him. His father worked long hours, dreaming his son might find honest labor. But honesty didn't pay enough to escape the crushing poverty of immigrant life. Luciano wasn't lured to crime out of excitement. He was driven by the simple reality that illegal work paid better, and moved faster, than legal work ever could. By his early teens he was already showing signs of leadership. Unlike many Italian boys who stuck strictly to their own kind, Luciano built friendships across ethnic lines. He wasn't limited by tribal pride. He saw strengths in everyone. The Jewish kids had financial smarts. The Irish boys had political contacts. The Italians brought fierce loyalty. Luciano didn't just make friends, he formed alliances. One of these alliances changed his life: Meyer Lansky. Their first encounters were tense, two sharp young minds measuring each other, but respect grew quickly. Lansky saw that Luciano's ambition wasn't reckless, it was strategic. Luciano saw in Lansky a thinker, someone who, like him, could see opportunity beyond the limits of ethnicity or neighborhood. Their friendship became the foundation of a future empire. Meanwhile, Luciano learned to balance risk with reward. His early hustles, collecting protection money, running gambling operations, small-time drug dealing, were ordinary rackets, but his approach was not. He kept meticulous mental notes. He analyzed what others ignored. He learned when to press, when to negotiate, and when to walk away. Older gang members noticed his discipline, the way he carried himself without boasting or threatening. Respect began to form organically. Violence, although unavoidable, became a tool for him rather than a habit. He didn't fight for ego. He fought when it mattered. And that restraint made him more dangerous than boys who threw punches at every insult. People feared hotheads. They trusted strategists. Luciano was becoming the latter. His reputation expanded in the neighborhood. Younger kids looked up to him. Older ones began to view him as an up-and-coming figure. He wasn't physically imposing, but he had presence, a calm that suggested he understood more than he let on. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. Influence doesn't come from noise, it comes from quiet confidence. As the years progressed, the slums stopped feeling like a cage and began feeling like training grounds. Every alley taught a lesson. Every betrayal taught caution. Every partnership taught value. Luciano realized he wasn't just surviving the streets, he was learning to dominate them. By 17, Luciano recognized that criminal work wasn't about chaos, it was about structure. He saw flaws in how local gangs operated: too emotional, too divided, too impulsive. Even then, he imagined a system with rules, hierarchy, and cooperation. He dreamed bigger than the block, bigger than the neighborhood. While others fought for nickels, he was thinking in empires. Opportunity for him wasn't tied to luck, it was tied to vision. The shopkeeper begging for protection, the corrupt policeman willing to look away, the rival gang barely holding its territory, these were not obstacles. They were openings. Luciano saw in each moment a possibility to climb higher. The slums that broke many boys built him instead. Every blow he endured, every deal he made, every risk he took shaped the psychology of a man who would one day redefine the American underworld. He learned how fear worked, how ambition operated, and how power could be shifted quietly, invisibly. By the time he stepped fully into organized crime, he was no longer Salvatore the street kid. He was a strategist, a negotiator, a rising force. He was not yet Lucky Luciano, but the transformation was already underway. By the time Salvatore Lucania was old enough to call himself Lucky Luciano, he had already mastered the single most important skill of leadership: recognizing value in unlikely places. The old Mafia bosses clung to tradition, swearing loyalty only to men who shared their blood, their village, their lineage. But Luciano saw what they couldn't. In the melting pot of early 20th century New York, power no longer belonged to isolated tribes. It belonged to those who could build bridges. And no bridges were more important than the ones he built with Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. The three of them could not have appeared more different. Luciano, sharp-eyed and serious, moved with a streetwise calm. Lansky, quiet and analytical, possessed a mathematical mind far ahead of his time. Siegel, handsome and explosive, radiated charisma and danger like a fuse always seconds from burning out. Yet together they formed the nucleus of something the criminal world had never seen before. A multi-ethnic partnership rooted not in blood or heritage but in ambition. The birth of an unlikely brotherhood. Luciano first encountered Meyer Lansky during the chaotic years of their adolescence. While many boys joined gangs for protection or pride, Lansky approached the street like a chessboard. He didn't fight unless necessary, didn't gamble without calculating the odds, didn't threaten unless he could deliver. Luciano saw in him a disciplined intelligence that echoed his own emerging worldview. Their first real interaction came when Luciano's crew attempted to shake down Lansky. Instead of cowering, Lansky stared straight ahead and refused to pay. Luciano respected the defiance, not because it was brave but because it was controlled. Fear didn't move Lansky. Logic did. Luciano realized a truth that few in his neighborhood had grasped. A man who cannot be intimidated can only be partnered with, never dominated. It was the beginning of a friendship that would transcend every ethnic barrier the underworld had previously erected. Bugsy Siegel joined this circle not through shared strategy, but through sheer presence. He was everything Lansky wasn't: loud, reckless, impulsive, but he was fiercely loyal and utterly fearless. Siegel didn't think in terms of consequences. He thought in terms of results. Where Lansky plotted, Siegel acted. Their combination was electricity and wiring, dangerous alone but unstoppable together. Luciano saw in them an opportunity rare in the criminal world: balance. Each man compensated for what the others lacked. And where the old Mafia saw cultural differences as threats, Luciano saw them as assets. Breaking the chains of tradition to understand the revolutionary nature of Luciano's alliances, one must understand how rigid the Mafia once was. Loyalty was inherited, not chosen. Sicilians trusted Sicilians, Neapolitans trusted Neapolitans, and everyone distrusted outsiders. To collaborate with Jews or Irish gangsters wasn't just taboo, it was seen as a betrayal of heritage. But Luciano believed heritage without progress was a slow death. The Italian gangs controlled certain neighborhoods, yes, but the Jewish gangs controlled the garment district, the financial flows, the gambling numbers. The Irish controlled politics, police influence, and labor unions. Power was scattered, inefficient, locked behind invisible walls of ethnicity. If he wanted to build something larger than a family, something closer to an organization, he needed access to all these assets. And for that, he needed alliances not restricted by blood. Lansky provided the intellectual bridge. Siegel provided the muscle and mobility. Luciano provided the vision. Together they formed a triumvirate that made ethnic lines irrelevant. A business, not a brotherhood. Luciano's approach to crime was unlike anything the underworld had witnessed. Where traditional bosses demanded loyalty first and competence second, Luciano reversed the order. He didn't care where a man came from, only what he could offer. This philosophy became the foundation for the National Crime Syndicate, years before it officially took shape. With Lansky he discussed numbers, percentages, risk management. Lansky introduced him to Jewish bookmakers who operated with the precision of bankers. Luciano saw how reliable and predictable their systems were compared to the emotional, often chaotic operations of traditional mafia crews. With Siegel he saw the value of aggression, not blind aggression but targeted force. Siegel was the kind of man who could walk into a volatile situation and bend it to his will. When Luciano needed someone to enforce respect, Siegel delivered it quickly and decisively. These alliances elevated Luciano above every other rising figure. They proved he could move outside the narrow expectations of Sicilian tradition and still maintain influence. Other gangsters admired his results but feared his thinking. They were used to a world where the Sicilians and Neapolitans fought each other endlessly. Luciano, meanwhile, was busy creating a diversified workforce. Bootlegging, the first true empire prohibition, became the proving ground for the alliance. Bootlegging was not a racket for small thinkers. It required supply chains, transportation routes, hidden breweries, bribed officials, and distribution networks that stretched beyond neighborhood borders. For old-world bosses stuck in territorial mindsets, it was too big, too complex, too modern. But modern was exactly where Luciano thrived. With Lansky's financial planning, Siegel's enforcement, and Luciano's diplomatic negotiations, they built a bootlegging machine that dwarfed the operations of older dons. They formed partnerships with Irish distributors, Jewish distillers, even rival Sicilian factions. But always on business terms, never on emotional ones. Money didn't care about ethnicity. And neither did Luciano. The psychology of a modern don. What made Luciano extraordinary was not just his talent for building alliances, it was his understanding of why they worked. He recognized that loyalty based solely on blood was brittle. It cracked under pressure, fractured under jealousy, and often collapsed when ambition grew. But loyalty built on shared profit, mutual benefit, and strategic alignment? That was strong. That could survive. Lansky trusted Luciano because Luciano respected his intellect. Siegel trusted him because Luciano respected his fearlessness. Their alliance wasn't a family, it was a company. Each man had a role, each man brought value, and each man knew that success depended on collaboration rather than dominance. In forming these alliances, Luciano stepped outside the world he was born into and began shaping the world he intended to rule. Laying the foundation of an empire, the friendships Luciano built in these years were more than personal bonds, they were structural pillars. Through them he learned how to manage diverse crews, negotiate across ethnic divides, and think on a national scale. He saw that true power did not lie in fear or tradition but in organization. These early partnerships didn't just strengthen his position, they rewrote the rules of American crime. Because of Lansky he thought like a financier. Because of Siegel he acted like a commander. Because of his own vision he became a modern don. The old mafia fought to preserve the past. Luciano prepared to build the future. And the men he chose, not born into his culture but chosen through ambition, would become the architects of the empire he had only begun imagining. The structure he was expected to obey. The mafia he inherited was not simply a criminal network, it was an extension of old Sicily, rigid, ritualistic, and defined by codes that valued tradition over progress. Leaders demanded loyalty through fear. Hierarchies were fixed in stone. And above all, omerta, the vow of silence, was treated as sacred law, unchangeable and unquestionable. But Luciano, even as a young soldier rising through the ranks, sensed something the older bosses could not. These ancient rules were choking the underworld's potential. America was a new world, full of expanding opportunities, yet the Mafia was still behaving like a medieval brotherhood trapped in its past. Quietly, without confrontation, Luciano began to question everything. The weight of the old code. Traditional Mafia bosses believed power came from lineage, not skill. Joe, the boss Masuria, embodied that philosophy. He expected absolute obedience, even when his decisions were short-sighted or fueled by pride. To him, the Mafia's strength lay in its Sicilian identity. Working with outsiders, Jews, Irish, anyone not Italian, was unthinkable. Loyalty to heritage mattered more than profit. This worldview created an organization that was emotionally charged but structurally weak. Wars erupted over insults, not business. Promotions were based on origin, not competence. Omerta protected bosses from scrutiny but prevented innovation. Luciano saw that the code meant to preserve the Mafia was actually limiting it. A quiet rebellion takes shape. Luciano did not challenge Masuria openly. That would have been suicide. Instead, he rebelled in silence. He formed alliances beyond Sicilian circles, especially with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel. These relationships alone were a violation of Masuria's unwritten rules. To Luciano, however, they represented the future. He didn't want to break the Mafia, he wanted to modernize it. As he watched other ethnic gangs operate with efficiency and coordination, an idea grew inside him. What if the Mafia ran like a business instead of a feudal kingdom? He began to favor deals over violence, negotiation over intimidation, intelligence over ritual. Slowly, subtly, he built influence not by demanding loyalty but by creating value. Seeing the cracks in Omerta. Omerta had once served a purpose. It protected members from law enforcement and ensured secrecy. But Luciano noticed its darker side. In practice, it shielded incompetent bosses, discouraged questioning, and forced obedience even when leadership failed. It silenced men who had ideas, ambition, or vision. Luciano believed silence should protect business, not ego. If a boss was hurting profits, why should tradition protect him? Why should the Mafia cling to rules that made it weak in a rapidly evolving America? Quietly, he began rewriting the purpose of Omerta in his own mind. Loyalty should be to success, not to outdated customs. Silence should prevent exposure, not prevent progress. Respect should be earned, not inherited. He wasn't breaking the code, he was redefining it. Understanding the power of adaptation, Luciano spent hours studying not just criminal operations but legitimate American industries. He admired how corporations expanded, delegated, and created chains of command that worked efficiently across states. Their leaders made decisions based on results, not pride. Why couldn't the underworld operate the same way? He imagined a future where different ethnic groups worked together. Leaders solved disputes through meetings, not murders. Power was shared, not hoarded. Profits determined policies, not tradition. These thoughts were revolutionary. And while he kept them hidden, they shaped every choice he made. Philosophical war with Masuria. On the surface, Luciano served Masuria faithfully. But beneath that surface, their worldviews clashed completely. Masuria believed, orders must be obeyed without question. Bloodlines determined trust. Violence was the first solution, not the last. Luciano believed, decisions must serve profit. Competence mattered more than heritage. Violence should be controlled, not casual. For Luciano, the old ways were not wrong, they were outdated. Masuria ruled through fear, but fear created instability. Luciano preferred influence earned through partnership, planning, and predictable gains. The divide between them widened with every dollar Luciano made through modern alliances. His success proved that ethnic cooperation worked. His negotiations showed that wars could be avoided. His methods demonstrated that business could grow faster than pride. Crafting a new internal code by his mid-20s, Luciano had mentally built a new rulebook for the Mafia, one that contradicted generations of Sicilian thinking. 1. Profit over pride. Feuds cost money. Negotiation makes money. 2. Competence over heritage. A smart outsider was better than a loyal insider who couldn't deliver. 3. Expansion over isolation. Working across ethnic lines turned small operations into national networks. 4. Shared power over dictatorship. One boss shouldn't control everything. Decision-making should involve multiple voices. This new philosophy wasn't idealistic, it was practical. It matched the realities of prohibition, where millions could be made if egos didn't get in the way. Rebellion through results. Luciano didn't need to openly defy Mafia. He let numbers speak. His rackets earned more money. His alliances expanded territories. His diplomacy reduced casualties. Younger gangsters saw him as the future. Older gangsters saw him as dangerous, not because he was violent but because he was innovative. Every success weakened the grip of tradition. Every peaceful deal exposed the inefficiency of old mafia codes. Luciano was proving, step by step, that the underworld didn't need rigid hierarchy, it needed structure, strategy, and shared profit. The chains began to break by the time New York plunged into the Castellamarese tensions. Luciano had already sown the seeds of change. His quiet rebellion had evolved into a movement of younger leaders who no longer wanted to die for honor or heritage. They wanted to build something that lasted. Luciano had not yet overthrown the old system, but he had exposed its flaws. He had not yet broken Omerta, but he had loosened its grip. He had not yet built the future, but he had drawn its blueprint. The old code was crumbling. And soon the new one would rise in its place. Before Luciano, crime in America lurched forward on impulse. Gangsters fought for turf without understanding markets, killed rivals without considering cost, and ran rackets based on emotion rather than efficiency. Bootlegging, gambling, narcotics, extortion. These were chaotic operations fueled by ego and survival, not strategy. But when Lucky Luciano rose into leadership, he brought with him something few criminals possessed. A businessman's mind inside a street-hardened body. To Luciano, crime wasn't rebellion. It wasn't cultural loyalty. It wasn't personal glory. It was business, an industry waiting for structure, management, and scale. He approached each racket the way a corporate leader examines a product line. What earns the most? What risks are involved? What resources are needed? What partnerships maximize profit? And most importantly, how do we eliminate waste, disorder, and unnecessary violence? Turning crime into an industry. Luciano understood that chaos was the enemy of profit. If soldiers killed without permission, police attention intensified. If gangs fought endlessly over small claims, operations collapsed. If captains pocketed too much money, the organization weakened. Disorder strangled growth. So he implemented a principle unheard of in the streets: standardization. Under his leadership, each racket, gambling, narcotics, prostitution, labor unions, loan sharking, was assigned structure. There were managers, collectors, accountants, enforcers, and negotiators. Responsibilities were clearly defined. Payment flows were mapped out. Decisions required consultation rather than spontaneous violence. He didn't want criminals with tempers. He wanted workers with roles. Violence became not a first resort, but a carefully scheduled expense. A last step used only when cheaper methods failed. Luciano wasn't eliminating brutality, he was refining it. Managing it. Ensuring it served business, not pride. Gambling, predictability over turf wars. Gambling was the backbone of the American underworld, but before Luciano it was small-scale and unstable. Street operators ran individual dice games, card rooms, and policy numbers with constant fear of police raids or rival attacks. Luciano saw the potential for something bigger. By integrating gambling operations across neighborhoods, he created a stable revenue stream. The system resembled a chain business. Local crews collected bets, central accountants tracked numbers, enforcers ensured smooth operations, distributors moved profits up the ladder. He turned scattered gambling dens into a networked industry. With Lansky's mathematical skill, they developed pricing models, payout ratios, and loss control strategies, innovations the old mafia couldn't imagine. They treated gambling like an investment portfolio, minimizing volatility and maximizing consistency. For the first time, the underworld had predictable income. Narcotics. A calculated risk. Narcotics were taboo among old Sicilian bosses, who believed drugs invited too much police pressure and moral decay. But Luciano saw a truth they ignored. The demand was enormous and the profit margins dwarfed everything else. He approached drugs scientifically. Where were the strongest markets? Who controlled supply routes? How could product be moved without trace? What distribution chain minimized arrests? He built alliances with international traffickers, streamlined shipping, and used non-Italian intermediaries to avoid linking drugs directly to mafia families. The operation became efficient, compartmentalized, and shockingly lucrative. To Luciano, drugs were not sinful. They were simply another commodity. The key was control. ensuring the organization remained invisible while others handled the riskier layers. Prostitution and nightlife, organization over chaos. Prostitution before Luciano was messy and violent. Pimps fought constantly, women were abused by multiple handlers, and police interference was constant. Luciano consolidated brothels into organized houses, with standardized rules. Fixed working hours, designated security, consistent pricing, medical supervision, centralized collection. He removed independent pimps, replacing them with managers who treated prostitution like any other service business. Nightclubs and speakeasies received similar restructuring. Luciano placed trusted partners inside these establishments to regulate cash flow, prevent skimming, and expand alcohol and entertainment rackets. Rather than forcing owners to pay through intimidation alone, he offered stability, protection, and supply, a business proposition more than a threat. Labor unions, the perfect revenue stream. Luciano recognized something the old bosses never grasped. In America, labor unions were gold mines. Whoever controlled unions controlled construction projects, trucking companies, waterfront operations, and factories. Instead of fighting union leaders, Luciano bought them. He placed mafia-friendly representatives inside unions, secured voting blocks, and negotiated contracts that benefited both workers and the underworld. Extortion became institutional rather than street-level. Businesses paid for labor peace. Union officers paid to maintain positions. Workers paid to resolve disputes. Companies paid to avoid strikes. This wasn't raw criminality, it was a sophisticated economic model. Luciano turned labor into a profit engine so efficient that many legitimate businessmen preferred working with the mafia. They were simply more organized. Extortion, reinvented as a service, traditional extortion relied on fear. Luciano replaced crude shakedowns with something more sustainable, a service-based model. Protection wasn't just avoiding violence, it came with real benefits. Guaranteed labor supply, guaranteed transportation routes, protection from rival gangs, police influence, access to loan sharks, discounted alcohol or gambling connections. Extortion became a package deal. Businesses paid because the mafia actually solved problems. This transformation changed the relationship between criminals and merchants. Instead of parasites, they became partners. Reluctant partners, perhaps, but partners nonetheless. Luciano's genius? Efficiency, not brutality. The greatest misconception about Luciano is that he was powerful because he was ruthless. But countless gangsters were ruthless. Luciano's true gift was efficiency, the ability to remove emotion from decisions, to analyze every racket with a businessman's clarity. He constantly asked, how do we reduce overhead? How do we control risk? How do we increase returns? How do we prevent internal conflict? How do we maintain stability? He viewed the mafia as a corporation, complete with departments, protocols, and oversight. This mindset allowed him to professionalize crime, turning chaotic, violent street operations into a smooth-running machine. Men followed him not because they were afraid, but because under him they earned more than they ever had. A corporate criminal empire. By the early 1930s, the foundation of Luciano's empire looked strikingly similar to a legitimate conglomerate. Bootlegging, distribution networks, suppliers, inventory management, gambling, accounting systems, pricing structures, narcotics, international supply chains, compartmentalized handlers, labor unions, political leverage, steady revenue, prostitution, regulated operations, health oversight, loan sharking, interest schedules, specialized collectors. Everything was interconnected, efficient, and scalable. Luciano had accomplished what no American gangster before him had even attempted. He industrialized crime. He turned violence into policy. He turned chaos into structure. He turned gangs into departments. He turned profits into power. And in doing so, he prepared the underworld for its greatest transformation, the creation of a national syndicate. Negotiation with danger. Every step upward required navigating a labyrinth of rivalries, alliances, suspicion, and calculated betrayal. Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, the two giants of old-world mafia power, were not simply obstacles but embodiments of everything Luciano believed was holding the future hostage. To survive these men, and eventually surpass them, he needed intellect sharper than any blade drawn in the streets. Luciano rose in a world where friendships shifted like shadows and where a handshake meant little if it didn't serve the moment. Alliances were temporary, loyalty conditional, and every decision was measured against the possibility of death. Power wasn't a trophy, it was a burden he learned to carry long before he fully possessed it. Under the shadow of Joe, the boss, Joe Masuria ruled the Italian underworld through intimidation. He was crude, loud, and guided by Sicilian tradition more than strategy. To many he was a father figure, to Luciano he was a cage. Mafia believed in old-world divisions. Italians must stick with Italians, outsiders must never be trusted, and loyalty must be blind. Luciano, who had already formed bonds with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, knew Mafia's worldview was a dead end. The future belonged to cooperation, not tribalism. But Mafia saw such thinking as betrayal. Luciano walked a tightrope, outwardly obedient, inwardly planning a different path. This tension wasn't just organizational, it was psychological. Luciano felt the weight of pretending loyalty while knowing he was destined to outgrow the man giving him orders. Each step upward was also a step deeper into danger. Diplomacy in a violent world. What set Luciano apart was his ability to treat violence as a last resort rather than a method of identity. He used diplomacy like a weapon, quiet, precise, and often more effective than a gun. While Mafia bullied his way through conflicts, Luciano observed, analyzed, and negotiated. He built bridges across ethnic lines, aligning with Jewish and Irish gangs that offered resources the Italians lacked. He listened more than he spoke, and because he didn't posture or boast, men confided in him. They trusted him, or at least thought they did. This diplomacy didn't go unnoticed. Mafia wondered why his protégé moved so fluidly among rivals. Maranzano, leading the opposing Castellamarese faction, wondered why Luciano remained loyal to a man so attached to outdated thinking. Everyone watched him, and yet no one fully understood him. That ambiguity became his greatest protection. Enter Salvatore Maranzano, a new kind of threat. Maranzano was everything Mafia wasn't: calculating, patient, disciplined. But beneath his polished exterior lived the same old Sicilian hunger for absolute power. He envisioned himself as a modern Caesar, reorganizing the Mafia into a rigid hierarchy where he would stand as supreme ruler. To younger, American-born gangsters, this vision felt outdated, another version of the same tyranny they experienced under Mafia, just dressed in better clothing. Luciano sensed immediately that Maranzano, for all his intelligence, would suffocate the future. His system allowed no room for independent thinkers, no tolerance for alliances with non-Italians, and no vision beyond personal dominance. Luciano knew he could not serve Mafia forever. Now he understood he could not serve Maranzano either. Strategic survival through neutral ground. Navigating the Castellamarese War required more than bravery, it required patience. Luciano refused to choose his side prematurely. Instead, he played mediator, speaking to both factions without fully committing to either. This neutrality was dangerous. To Mafia it looked like disloyalty. To Maranzano it looked like temptation. Yet Luciano maintained balance through charm, calculation, and an uncanny sense of timing. He assured both sides he understood their goals. He agreed with their philosophies without promising allegiance. He allowed each boss to believe he might be useful later. Luciano wasn't indecisive, he was collecting data, evaluating weaknesses, understanding who could be manipulated, and preparing for the moment when decisiveness would matter most. The psychological weight of dual loyalties balancing between Mafia and Maranzano came with a heavy emotional cost. Luciano lived daily with the knowledge that either man could interpret a single conversation as betrayal. His life depended on silence, subtlety, and self-control. He slept lightly. He watched every doorway. He measured every word. This wasn't fear, it was discipline. The mental strain forged him into a thinker unlike any other gangster of his generation. He learned that power demanded stillness under pressure, clarity under threat, and the ability to betray without hesitation when the moment required it. Betrayal as a tool, not a passion. Luciano didn't betray out of anger. His betrayals were strategic, planned like military operations. When he finally chose to side with Maranzano against Mafia, it wasn't because he loved Maranzano's vision, but because Mafia stood directly in the way of modernization. Mafia had given Luciano protection and opportunity, yet sentiment could not outweigh survival. In ordering Mafia's death, Luciano severed his last tie to the old-world Mafia. It was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of evolution. But betrayal cuts in both directions. As soon as Maranzano claimed victory, Luciano realized what came next. Maranzano's ambition was too big, his ego too large, his desire for total control incompatible with Luciano's dream of a cooperative syndicate. Luciano knew he would have to betray again, and this time faster. Seeing the future that others couldn't, where Mafia saw ethnicity and Maranzano saw hierarchy, Luciano saw infrastructure. He envisioned an American mafia that operated like a corporation, with committees instead of dictators, partnerships instead of feuds, and leaders chosen for competence, not birthright. To achieve this, he had to remove both men who stood for the past. And he had to do so without destroying the fragile balance that held the underworld together. The decision to kill Maranzano came not from ambition, but from clarity. The old ways had no place in the modern world he was building. The true cost of power. By navigating rivalries with brilliance and manipulation, Luciano rose above men stronger, older, and more violent than himself. But the ascent carried a price. Betrayal leaves scars. Power demands sacrifice. Luciano lost parts of himself along the way: trust, innocence, and any illusion that leadership came without emotional consequence. He learned that to lead meant to choose who lived and who died, and to live with those choices long after the shots were fired. A leader forged in a labyrinth, Luciano emerged from this web of enemies and allies not because he was the most ruthless, but because he was the most strategic. He anticipated outcomes others couldn't see, acted when others hesitated, and understood that sometimes survival demanded disloyalty. He didn't seek betrayal. He used it. He didn't crave power. He accepted its weight. He didn't aspire to be a king. He aspired to build a system. And the labyrinth he mastered would soon lead to the moment that changed the Mafia forever. Alleyways, shuttered restaurants, and the uneasy silence of men who understood that a wrong word could end a life. It was a Mafia civil war, chaotic, relentless, and fueled by two competing visions of power: Joe the Boss Masuria's crude Americanized dominance and Salvatore Maranzano's disciplined Sicilian ambition. Caught between them stood Lucky Luciano, a man who could not choose a side without sealing his fate. This war became the crucible in which he refined his strategy, hardened his resolve, and ultimately reshaped the underworld. The seeds of conflict. By 1929, tension between Masuria and Maranzano had grown unavoidable. Masuria ruled through intimidation, demanding tribute and blind loyalty. Maranzano, newly arrived from Sicily, viewed himself as a military commander destined to reorganize the Mafia into a Roman-style hierarchy. Their ambitions collided violently. Assassinations escalated. Bodies appeared in alleyways, on docks, and outside tenements. Every day delivered a new casualty, a new message. No one was safe, not even soldiers who had tried to remain neutral. New York became a battlefield where no side gained advantage for long. Luciano watched the destruction with a calculating calm. He knew neither man could lead the Mafia into the future he envisioned. Yet survival demanded loyalty, at least the illusion of it. Luciano's delicate balancing act. Luciano's genius was not in choosing sides quickly, but in refusing to choose until timing favored him. He reassured Masuria of his devotion while quietly maintaining a line of communication with Maranzano. Each man saw potential in him. Each hoped to use him as a weapon. Each underestimated him. Luciano, meanwhile, studied both factions like a tactician. He learned their strengths, their weaknesses, and their blind spots. He made himself invaluable while revealing nothing. Diplomacy became his armor, not kindness but strategic silence. This dual loyalty was dangerous. One misstep could mean an unmarked grave. Yet Luciano's calm, analytical approach made the impossible seem natural. The assassination attempt, a warning from the old world, in late 1929, Luciano's balancing act nearly ended in death. He was kidnapped, beaten, stabbed, and dumped on a Staten Island beach, left to bleed and rot. Though he never publicly named the attackers, many believed Masuria's men acted under suspicion that Luciano was drifting toward Maranzano. Luciano survived barely. Reporters asked how he lived. He simply smiled and said he was lucky. The truth was different. The near-death experience sharpened his resolve. It made one fact unavoidable: the old Mafia would kill him long before it allowed him to lead. If he wanted a future, he had to destroy the past. Secret alliances and hidden plans. Recovering from the attack, Luciano strengthened his core alliances: Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese. These men represented the future. Americanized, ambitious, unafraid to break from Sicilian rigidity. Together, they formed a quiet coalition determined to end the war. Luciano's plan was bold and unprecedented: remove Masuria, remove Maranzano, rebuild the Mafia as a cooperative syndicate instead of a monarchy. It wasn't just a coup. It was a blueprint. A coup at Coney Island. The end of Masuria. By early 1931, Luciano decided Masuria had to die first. But killing the boss outright was impossible, unless Masuria himself walked into the trap. Luciano used trust as bait. On April 15, 1931, he invited Masuria to a casual lunch at a Coney Island restaurant. They played cards, shared small talk. Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. Moments later, 4 gunmen, Siegel, Genovese, Anastasia, and Adonis, stormed the room and executed Masuria in a hail of bullets. The killing was swift, efficient, and symbolic. With Masuria gone, the war moved into its final phase. Luciano, however, did not celebrate. He knew another threat was waiting. Maranzano's rule, a new kind of danger. Maranzano wasted no time declaring himself Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. He reorganized the Mafia into 5 families and placed himself at the top. Initially, he rewarded Luciano, appointing him a senior figure. But power changed Maranzano quickly. He began acting like a dictator, ordering surveillance on anyone he suspected of ambition, especially Luciano. He created lists of men to be eliminated, believing only fear could maintain his authority. His paranoia revealed what Luciano had suspected all along. Maranzano was merely another version of Masuria, smarter perhaps, but just as tyrannical. Luciano realized that if he did not act soon, he would be the next victim. The second coup, quiet, surgical, final. This time Luciano needed subtlety. Maranzano was heavily guarded by Sicilian loyalists who would never allow an Italian hit squad inside. So Luciano executed a revolutionary idea. Use Jewish assassins, men Maranzano's guards wouldn't recognize. Disguised as federal agents, the hitmen walked into Maranzano's office on September 10, 1931. They disarmed his guards, cornered him, and killed him with ruthless precision. No escape, no retaliation, no prolonged war. In minutes, the age of supreme bosses ended. A new era rises from the shadows. With both Masuria and Maranzano gone, Luciano had accomplished something no mafia figure ever had. He ended a war and prevented a new dictator from emerging. His next move was transformative. He abolished the title boss of all bosses, recognizing that absolute power only produced absolute conflict. In its place, he established the Commission, a body of leaders from each family who would vote on decisions and resolve disagreements through negotiation instead of bullets. This was Luciano's quiet revolution, a mafia built on structure, stability, and shared interest. The war had shown him the cost of ego-driven leadership. Now he intended to ensure it never returned. The Hidden War's true legacy. The Castellamarese conflict forged Luciano not through glory, but through fire. He survived betrayal, torture, shifting loyalties, and the collapse of 2 regimes. He learned how to predict danger, how to manipulate outcomes, and how to build alliances that transcended old-world divisions. Most importantly, he learned that real power is not loud. Real power is planned, calculated, silent. When the smoke cleared, the underworld saw not a lucky survivor but a visionary. A man who had reshaped chaos into order. A man who understood war deeply enough to end it. Lucky Luciano had become exactly what the Mafia needed, and everything the old guard feared. When the Castellamarese war ended, the Mafia was standing on broken ground. 2 bosses were dead, alliances were shredded, and the underworld was exhausted from years of internal bloodshed. But in this rare moment of instability, Lucky Luciano saw something no one else did. An opening. A chance to build not just a new hierarchy, but a new operating system for the entire American underworld. He didn't want to be a tyrant. He didn't want to inherit the title of Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, that had doomed both Masuria and Maranzano. Luciano believed that absolute power was a curse, a target painted on the forehead of whoever claimed it. His vision wasn't dominance. It was stability. And stability required a revolution. The vision forms. Luciano spent years watching the Mafia tear itself apart because of pride, ego, and rigid tradition. The Masuria-Maranzano struggle proved what he already knew. When one man tries to rule everything, the rest of the underworld unites to destroy him. Dictatorship produced only one thing, war. So he designed something radically different. A system where no single boss ruled, yet every boss had power. This was the birth of the Commission. A boardroom for crime. Luciano looked at American corporations and political machines and saw efficiency, delegation, and shared decision-making. He borrowed those principles and reshaped the Mafia around them. The Commission was a national crime boardroom, made up of leaders from the 5 New York families, Chicago, Buffalo, major East Coast and Midwestern cities. Each boss controlled his own territory, but all major issues, hits, disputes, expansions, and national rackets required collective agreement. No more kings. No more supreme bosses. Only partners. Luciano decentralized power while increasing cooperation. That paradox was the core of his genius. Ending the old feuds. One of Luciano's first goals was to eliminate the ancient vendettas that had traveled from Sicily to New York. Blood feuds had destroyed fortunes and nearly destroyed the Mafia itself. Under the commission, personal grudges no longer dictated policy. Disputes were brought to the table. Arguments were settled by vote. Violence became a last resort. For the first time, the Mafia had a judicial system, a way to maintain peace without spilling blood on the streets. Defining territory and cooperation. Before Luciano, Mafia families constantly fought over borders. Small disputes escalated into full-scale wars. Luciano created clear territorial boundaries and encouraged shared ventures when profitable. A gambling racket crossing two families' districts? Split it. A union that benefited 3 cities? Share it. A narcotics pipeline stretching across states? Manage it cooperatively. He converted competitors into collaborators. The Mafia stopped behaving like feuding clans and started functioning like a national organization. National expansion. A coast-to-coast syndicate with the commission established, Luciano turned outward. He wanted the Mafia to grow beyond New York's borders and become a unified force across America. Chicago, under the remnants of Capone's influence, joined as a major partner. Buffalo and Detroit followed. Even smaller families gained representation, ensuring nationwide coordination of gambling networks, smuggling routes and union control. No longer was the Mafia a loose collection of independent gangs. Under Luciano, it became a national corporation, capable of synchronized operations on a scale unimaginable under the old system. Rules for the new era. To keep the syndicate stable, Luciano introduced rules that were revolutionary for the Mafia. No murders of made men without commission approval. No wars without a majority vote. Territory lines must be respected. Profits should guide decisions, not pride. No boss could claim supreme authority. These rules created predictability, the foundation of long-term criminal enterprise. The Mafia, for the first time, had structure instead of chaos. Turning crime into governance. What made the commission extraordinary wasn't just the distribution of power, it was Luciano's understanding of human nature. He knew that if bosses felt included, they wouldn't revolt. If profits flowed steadily, they wouldn't fight. If decisions were shared, no one would feel threatened. He wasn't ruling the Mafia. He was managing it. Like a CEO balancing ambitious executives, Luciano created a system that allowed strong personalities to coexist without tearing the organization apart. A silent revolution, not a violent one. The brilliance of the commission wasn't in its creation, but in how seamlessly Luciano implemented it. There were no speeches, no declarations, no grand ceremonies. Luciano framed it as a protective measure, a way to prevent future wars, to stabilize business, to protect everyone's interests. He didn't impose power. He distributed it. He made the bosses believe the commission was theirs, even though its design carried his fingerprints on every corner. This subtlety allowed the Mafia to embrace a radical transformation without resistance. A system built to prevent another Luciano. Ironically, Luciano's greatest creation was designed to prevent another leader like him. The commission ensured that no one man could ever again seize total control. He understood the danger of allowing a single figure too much influence. He had seen how quickly ambition turned into paranoia, how paranoia turned into violence, and how violence consumed everything. With the commission, Luciano replaced dictatorship with diplomacy. He replaced uncertainty with structure. He replaced chaos with order. It was not only a reform. It was a rewrite. The peak of his genius, the creation of the commission, was the moment Luciano's brilliance reached its peak. Everything he had learned, from the slums, from betrayal, from war, culminated in this system. It was a structure forged from pain, sharpened by strategy, and powered by cooperation. He transformed the Mafia from a tribal, emotion-driven network into a national criminal syndicate built on efficiency, negotiation, and shared authority. This was Luciano's quiet revolution. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply redesigned the underworld, and made every boss believe they were part of something greater. The underworld rewritten. When the commission began its work, the Mafia entered its golden age. Profits soared. War stopped. Influence spread into unions, politics, and businesses nationwide. Luciano had not just changed the rules, he had changed the entire philosophy of organized crime. He turned the Mafia into an institution. He turned chaos into governance. He turned enemies into partners. And without firing a single shot, he reshaped the future. For years, Lucky Luciano appeared untouchable. He had survived gang wars, toppled 2 bosses, and re-engineered the Mafia into a national syndicate. His brilliance had carried him to heights no gangster before him had reached. But power, once secure, begins to rot at the edges. And for Luciano, the first cracks appeared not in gunfire or street betrayals, but in the subtle, creeping pressure of a world suddenly waking up to the empire he had built. The climate shifts. America begins to look closer. The 1930s were changing. Prohibition was collapsing, jobs were scarce, and crime, once tolerated as a dark necessity, became a symbol of national decay. Newspapers sensationalized gangsters like movie stars. Politicians vowed to clean up the country. Law enforcement agencies, desperate to prove their relevance, found a villain perfectly suited to their crusade: the Mafia. Luciano wasn't yet a household name, but the effects of his empire were everywhere. In unions, gambling parlors, nightclubs, and backroom politics. As the commission grew stronger, so did the fear surrounding it. The public imagined an invisible army pulling the strings of cities. They weren't entirely wrong. And with fear came scrutiny. Government eyes focus on the invisible boss. For years, Luciano had operated from behind the curtain. He wasn't flashy like Bugsy Siegel, nor theatrical like Al Capone. His genius lay in silence, influence, and distance. But influence, once vast enough, becomes visible even without a spotlight. Investigators noticed patterns: labor strikes ending mysteriously after quiet meetings, gambling dens protected by police who never made arrests, union funds disappearing without explanation, politicians receiving donations from unknown sources. Luciano's fingerprints were not found at crime scenes, they were found in systems. That was far more dangerous. Soon, a young and ambitious prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey turned his attention toward him. Dewey represented a new kind of enemy, one motivated not by vengeance or profit, but by public duty and ambition. Luciano could negotiate with gangsters, bribe police, intimidate rivals. But he could not charm a man whose future depended on destroying him. Internal fractures. The empire begins to strain while the government tightened its grip. Trouble grew inside Luciano's own organization. The commission had created order, yes, but order required constant balance. And as cracks formed, loyalties wavered. Some bosses feared that Luciano had become too influential. Others resented his relationships outside Italian circles. A few saw opportunity in his rising problems. Most dangerous among these was Vito Genovese, Luciano's ambitious lieutenant. Genovese had always admired Luciano, but admiration mixed with envy is a volatile thing. Genovese believed he deserved greater power, and as government heat intensified, he quietly began shifting loyalty toward himself. This was betrayal in its most dangerous form, not from an enemy, but from a man who knew Luciano's every strength and weakness. A dangerous lifestyle. The personal missteps. Luciano's brilliance lay in strategy, but he was not without flaws. He enjoyed nightlife, women, luxury, the pleasures that wealth made effortless. As he grew more confident, he grew more visible. Nightclubs, showgirls, and high-end hotels became his nightly orbit. This visibility made him a convenient target for moral crusaders. The newspapers painted him as a corrupter of women, a destroyer of youth, a symbol of decadence. Stories were exaggerated, fabricated, or embellished, but the effect was real. Luciano became a villain in the public imagination. And public imagination is a powerful enemy. Dewey's crusade, a war of image and law. Dewey realized he couldn't charge Luciano with murder or racketeering. Luciano was too careful for that. So he attacked the weakest link: prostitution. It was a charge that carried social outrage and legal consequence. Through intimidation and manipulation, Dewey's team convinced brothel workers to testify against Luciano. Some witnesses lied. Some exaggerated. Some were promised freedom. But Dewey didn't need airtight truth, he needed public spectacle. Luciano underestimated him. He believed the Mafia's influence could shield him from prosecution. He believed the witnesses would crumble under pressure. He believed the system was still predictable. This miscalculation cost him everything. The trial. Power meets reality. When the trial began in 1936, the courtroom became a theater. Dewey painted Luciano as the mastermind behind a sprawling prostitution ring, a man whose wealth and charm masked pure exploitation. The press devoured every detail. And for the first time, Luciano had no control over the narrative. He appeared furious, disbelieving, and then, in rare moments, visibly shaken. The walls that once protected him felt thin. His empire felt far away. The psychological unraveling had begun. The jury found him guilty on 62 counts. Luciano, the mastermind of a national syndicate, was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. Power slips away, slowly, quietly. Prison didn't break Luciano physically, but it fractured the illusion of invincibility that had protected him for years. Isolation brought introspection. Rumors filtered in. Genovese was maneuvering for power, bosses were realigning without him, alliances he once controlled had begun to decay. Luciano had built a system designed to survive without kings, and now he was learning the heavy truth. Systems can survive but men cannot. Each passing year felt like a quiet betrayal from the world he had shaped. Influence faded. The commission evolved without him. New alliances formed, new rules written. He had designed a machine so strong that it no longer needed him. The inevitability of the fall. Luciano's downfall wasn't sudden. It was a slow erosion, government pressure from above, ambition from within, missteps from his own hand. His brilliance had built an empire, but it had also created enemies he could not see and forces he could not stop. Paranoia replaced confidence. Silence replaced strategy. Isolation replaced influence. The fall of Lucky Luciano did not come from a bullet, a betrayal alone, or a single mistake. It came from the weight of power itself, a weight no man can carry forever. The shadows he once commanded now closed around him. And the architect of the modern Mafia stepped into the darkness of his own making. The courtroom where Lucky Luciano's fate would be sealed didn't feel like a place of justice. It felt like a stage. Hot lights. Packed benches. Reporters elbow to elbow. Flashbulbs exploding like gunfire. New York had turned Luciano into the ultimate symbol of organized vice, and now the public demanded a spectacle. Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey was prepared to deliver one. From the first day of the 1936 trial, it was clear this would be no ordinary proceeding. Crowds lined the courthouse steps, desperate for a glimpse of the infamous Vice King. Journalists filled the hallways, ready to transmit every smirk, every witness breakdown, every courtroom whisper. Headlines had already done the job of conviction before the trial even began. Luciano entered each morning calm, tailored, expressionless, a man who understood that optics mattered. He knew the system was bending against him, but he refused to appear shaken. Behind that stillness, however, lay the pressure of something unprecedented. A prosecution not about crime alone, but about image, morality, and public fear. Dewey's performance, sharp, cold, unrelenting. Thomas E. Dewey approached the case like an assassin. His voice was steady, his questions sharp, his strategy precise. He wasn't prosecuting just a man, he was prosecuting the very idea of criminal organization. Dewey recognized Luciano's true threat, not violence but structure. Not street-level crime but the corporate-style empire he'd built. Unable to catch Luciano on murder or racketeering, Dewey attacked where Luciano seemed weakest in public perception: prostitution. It wasn't the most lucrative part of his empire, nor the most organized, but it stirred moral outrage. And outrage wins juries. To Dewey, Luciano became the shadow behind every brothel door in New York. A puppeteer of vice. A corrupter of women. A silent profiteer. This was the story Dewey told, and the press amplified it with each passing day. Witnesses for the prosecution, fear, tears, and fabrication. One by one, prostitutes and brothel owners took the stand. Some were frightened. Some were coached. Many had been promised leniency. A few simply repeated whatever Dewey's investigators fed them. Their stories were inconsistent, contradictory, even impossible at times, yet devastating in their emotional force. They described threats, payments, beatings, and a fear that hovered over their world like a curse. Although none had met Luciano personally, each insisted he was the force behind their suffering. Luciano sat stone-faced, jaw tight. He recognized lies, exaggerations, and rehearsed speeches. But he also recognized something worse. Emotion beats logic in a courtroom. His attorney, George Morton Levy, tore into testimony after testimony, exposing cracks and contradictions. But each time Levy dismantled a witness, Dewey responded with another, louder, more emotional, more damaging. It didn't matter that no money trail led to Luciano. It didn't matter that no witness could place him at a brothel. It didn't matter that the structure Dewey described didn't match how Luciano actually ran rackets. What mattered was the performance. Villain and visionary, two men on trial. The tragedy of the trial was its duality. One, Luciano was the visionary, a man who ended wars, created the commission, modernized crime, and thought with a strategist's precision. The other, Luciano, was the villain the papers adored, a monster who commodified women, orchestrated pain, and profited from exploitation. Both images were present in the courtroom. Both lived inside him. And the jury was asked to decide which one defined his legacy. The media, judge, jury, and audience. By now, the newspapers weren't just reporting the trial. They were shaping it. Lucky's vice empire revealed. Girls tell of terror and control. Dewey strikes back at organized crime. Each headline poisoned the well. Each story narrowed the jury's imagination. Public opinion wasn't simply turning, it had already turned. Luciano's downfall became entertainment. Closing arguments. Dewey's final strike. Dewey's closing argument was masterful. He argued that Luciano didn't need to touch the business personally. His reputation was enough to control it. His orders, even unspoken, shaped the entire underworld. This argument weaponized Luciano's true power, his ability to influence without appearing. What made him brilliant now damned him. Levy countered with clarity and logic. But logic felt small against the tidal wave of emotion and spectacle. The verdict, a life condensed to a sentence on June 7, 1936, after only hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty. On all 62 counts. Luciano did not flinch. His face remained impassive, but inside he understood what had happened. The system needed a villain. The press needed a headline. The public needed a symbol of justice. And Dewey needed a victory. Luciano had become all of these at once. The sentence, power meets iron bars. Judge Philip J. McCook delivered the final blow. 30 to 50 years in prison. Gasps filled the courtroom. Cameras flashed. Reporters sprinted outside to file stories. Luciano nodded once, a gesture of acceptance, resignation, or perhaps recognition of fate. His empire had given him unprecedented power. But that same empire had made him too large, too visible, too necessary to destroy. The trial did not simply punish a criminal. It ended an era. It caged a visionary. And it signaled the beginning of Luciano's slow descent from the throne he had built with his mind. When Lucky Luciano entered Clinton Correctional Facility in 1936, many believed his reign was finished. A 30 to 50-year sentence was meant to bury him, to dismantle everything he had built and scatter his influence across the prison walls. But power, once rooted deeply enough, doesn't vanish. It adapts. It mutates. It finds new channels. And Luciano, even stripped of suits, money, and freedom, remained a man others feared, respected, and needed. A new kingdom, a new strategy. Prison was a world with its own hierarchy, its own economy, its own dangers. But compared to the slums and gang wars Luciano had survived, it held few surprises. Where other inmates saw confinement, Luciano saw structure, and structure could be shaped. He began quietly. No threats. No demands. Just observation. Within weeks, he understood the flow of contraband, the alliances between guards and prisoners, the rivalries that determined power on the inside. And as on the outside, his demeanor, calm, confident, unreadable, made others gravitate toward him. Inmates who once idolized him in newspapers now sought him out. Guards, aware of the legend in their midst, treated him with wary respect. Luciano offered advice, settled disputes, and avoided unnecessary violence. Diplomacy became his strongest weapon. Fear kept him untouchable. Wisdom made him indispensable. Running the empire through steel bars despite the walls, Luciano's reach stretched far beyond the prison yard. The Mafia was now a machine he had built, and many components still relied on him. Visitors, coded letters, and discreet intermediaries allowed him to remain a voice in the shadows. He did not micromanage, he guided. He approved major decisions, advised on conflicts, and ensured the commission continued functioning as he intended. The bosses on the outside knew two truths. Luciano's mind was more valuable than his presence, and abandoning him would fracture the delicate balance he had created. From his cell, he maintained order better than many bosses did in freedom. But influence came with envy. Some gangsters resented his ability to rule from confinement. Others feared he would one day return. The underworld whispered his name with both reverence and anxiety. Luciano had become something rare, a leader whose power survived the loss of physical freedom. The changing world beyond the prison gates. While Luciano settled into his new rhythm, America changed. World War II erupted in Europe, dragging global trade routes, military supply chains, and national security into chaos. Rumors spread of German submarines stalking the East Coast, and in 1942, a mysterious fire destroyed the French luxury liner Normandy while docked in New York Harbor. Was it sabotage? Accident? The government feared the worst. U.S. Naval intelligence began suspecting enemy infiltration along the docks, areas controlled heavily by labor unions and organized crime. The Navy needed cooperation from people who understood the streets, the longshoremen, the docks, and their invisible networks. They needed access to a world only one man truly understood, Lucky Luciano's. The irony of alliance. A government turns to a convict in a twist worthy of a fiction novel. The same federal system that once paraded Luciano as a symbol of corruption now quietly sought his help. The Navy contacted figures within Luciano's circle, including Meyer Lansky, who assured them that Luciano still held enough respect to coordinate dock security, if offered terms. And so a secret arrangement began. Luciano agreed to assist U.S. naval intelligence in exchange for a potential reduction in his sentence. Through intermediaries, he ensured that longshoremen cooperated, that sabotage ceased, and that intelligence about suspicious activity reached the government efficiently. It was a strange partnership, a convicted criminal mastermind helping the U.S. military, the Mafia assisting in national defense, war turning enemies into assets. But it worked. Crime syndicates stabilized the docks. Rumors of infiltration quieted. Smuggling routes became intelligence routes. And quietly, Luciano's value to the government grew. Power in paradox for Luciano, cooperating with the government was not betrayal, it was strategy. He understood survival required adaptation. If aligning with federal authorities preserved his influence and offered a path to freedom, he would use the opportunity. Yet the irony was heavy. The man the courts condemned as a predator and organizer of vice became, behind bars, a silent partner in national security. This contradiction fascinated the public and bewildered officials. But Luciano himself remained calm. He saw the larger picture. Power is not where you stand. Power is whose actions depend on you. And now the U.S. Navy, the most powerful fleet in the world, depended on him. Life in confinement. Influence with limits despite his reach, prison was still prison. Luciano faced long stretches of isolation, frustration, and introspection. He could not walk the streets he once controlled. He could not attend commission meetings. He could not silence rivals personally. Each year chipped away at his patience, even as his legend grew. But inside those steel bars he learned another truth. Power that survives hardship becomes something deeper, something unshakable. Luciano's name remained revered. His guidance traveled far beyond the cell block. Even his enemies acknowledged he had become an elder statesman of organized crime. A king without a throne, yet still a king. Luciano entered prison as a fallen ruler. He became, in time, a quiet phantom of influence. Neither fully gone nor fully present, but undeniably powerful. His collaboration with the U.S. government, his continued sway over Mafia affairs, and his ability to survive psychologically in confinement proved something essential about him. Luciano didn't just build an empire. He built systems that outlived freedom, distance, and even betrayal. And behind bars, those systems kept him on the throne, a king whose kingdom extended far beyond the prison walls. When Lucky Luciano walked out of prison in 1946, he was not a free man. He was a man in transit, granted release only to be deported immediately to a country he no longer belonged to. The ship that carried him across the Atlantic also carried the final truth he had long resisted. His empire was no longer his, and the world he built had learned to function without him. Italy greeted him not with celebration, but with suspicion. To Italian authorities he was a danger, to Americans a problem exported, to the underworld, a relic returning to a stage where no one needed him. Luciano stepped onto Sicilian soil as a man caught between worlds, an architect whose blueprints had outlived the architect himself. A stranger in his homeland. Sicily was beautiful, but beauty meant nothing to Luciano. The villages felt too quiet, the streets too slow, the rhythms unfamiliar. He had left as a poor child. He returned as an aging legend. But legends are only powerful where their stories still matter. In Italy, Luciano found himself being watched constantly. Police shadowed him through narrow streets, noted his visitors, inspected his letters. They feared he would rebuild the American Mafia from overseas. Ironically, Luciano did consider staying involved, but what he found instead was something far more devastating. The empire no longer needed its founder. The commission he created ran smoothly without him. Bosses he once groomed now answered to each other, not to him. He could advise, yes. But command? No. Distance had weakened him, and the Mafia valued presence almost as much as power. A man trying to stay relevant. Luciano tried to regain footing. He reached out to American contacts, attempted to influence narcotics routes, and offered guidance on international operations. Some listened out of respect, others out of habit. But true control slipped through his fingers. Younger gangsters saw him as history, impressive, yes, but outdated. They were building new networks, forming new alliances, embracing opportunities Luciano had never imagined. His name still carried weight, but not the kind that shaped decisions. It was prestige without leverage. He tried to establish himself in Havana, briefly tasting the excitement of a city buzzing with crime, casinos, and American mob figures. Havana gave him a glimpse of the power he once wielded. For a moment he felt alive again, advising, negotiating, orchestrating behind the scenes. But it didn't last. American pressure forced Cuba to expel him. Once again Luciano found himself on a ship, returning to Italy with nothing but echoes of influence trailing behind him. The slow unraveling. The greatest enemy of a man like Luciano was not the law, it was irrelevance. He spent much of his later years in Naples, living in modest apartments, frequenting cafes, receiving visitors who came more for the legend than for the leader. They asked about the past, not the future. They wanted stories, not orders. For a man who once shaped the direction of a nation's underworld, this shift was unbearable. The system he designed, decentralized, cooperative, self-sustaining, had achieved its purpose. But in achieving it, it erased the need for the man who built it. The Commission no longer relied on singular visionaries. That had been the entire point. And that truth gnawed at him. Loneliness in the shadow of legacy. Luciano's emotional decline was a quiet one. He was not a man who confessed sadness, but it seeped through in letters, in conversations with trusted friends, in the long silences he fell into while staring out at the sea. He missed New York, the noise, the chaos, the corners he conquered. He missed his youth when every risk felt like destiny. He missed the men who had once walked beside him, Lansky, Siegel, Costello, each now distant, preoccupied, or gone. Exile was not just a place. It was a feeling, being alive in a world that no longer aligned with your purpose. His days became repetitive. Walks, coffees, quiet meetings, occasional surveillance by Italian police. He remained sharp, but sharpness without influence cut nothing. Attempts to reclaim the throne. There were moments when Luciano tried to reassert himself. He gave instructions to smugglers, advised on heroin operations, and attempted to mediate disputes from afar. But these were shadows of his former authority. Decisions were often overridden. Plans unfolded without his input. Every attempt to reclaim his past revealed the same unchangeable truth. The empire had grown beyond him. The Mafia he created no longer required a singular architect. It had become an institution, something stable, decentralized, resilient. That was Luciano's greatest success. And his deepest wound. Acceptance. The final evolution. In his final years, Luciano began to accept what he could not change. He shifted from command to reflection, from ambition to reminiscence. He spoke with younger men not as a ruler but as a storyteller. He recounted the days of Masuria and Maranzano, the creation of the Commission, the nights of Prohibition, passing on a history only he could tell. There was dignity in that role. And pain. He understood the irony. He had built a mafia that no longer needed a king, and therefore no longer needed him. But he also recognized the brilliance of it. His ideas had survived arrests, wars, deaths, and continents. What he had built would endure long after his exile, his loneliness, and even his life. The endgame of a visionary. On January 26, 1962, Luciano collapsed at the Naples airport after meeting a film producer. He died not in battle, not in power, but in quiet exile, a man remembered more for his mind than his might. In the end, he was neither king nor captive, but something in between. A visionary exiled by the very vision that defined him. The empire had moved on. The world had changed. And Luciano, at last, understood that his greatest achievement was also his final goodbye. Lucky Luciano died far from the streets he once ruled, yet his influence continued to move through the underworld like a current shaping the shoreline long after the storm has passed. His revolution did not end with his exile. It matured without him, expanded beyond him, and echoed through criminal networks across continents. Luciano had built the first blueprint for modern organized crime, a structure so adaptable that it survived wars, exile, leadership changes, and the relentless scrutiny of governments. His legacy was not one man's reign. It was an operating system. The Commission, a structure that outlived its creator. The institution Luciano designed became the cornerstone of American organized crime for decades. The five families continued to use the Commission as a governing body. Even when wars erupted later, like the Colombo or Gambino conflicts, they unfolded within a framework Luciano had introduced: shared power, structured negotiation, and predictable boundaries. The Commission allowed the Mafia to coordinate national rackets, manage disputes without open warfare, maintain territories without constant bloodshed, expand operations in labor unions, gambling, narcotics, and construction. Other criminal organizations observed and adopted similar models. From Chicago's outfit to Montreal's risotto family, Luciano's ideas proved exportable. Structure, once introduced to crime, became impossible to unsee. A global blueprint for organized crime, Luciano's influence reached far beyond American shores. European syndicates, including the Sicilian Mafia, the 'Ndrangheta, and even emerging post-war criminal groups, embraced elements of Luciano's philosophy. The Sicilian Mafia, once rigidly hierarchical and tradition-bound, began adopting more flexible structures. They formed inter-family commissions, coordinated international drug trafficking routes, and operated with financial sophistication previously unseen. In Asia, in Latin America, and Eastern Europe, wherever organized crime evolved beyond tribal roots, Luciano's fingerprints appeared indirectly. Decentralized leadership models, multi-ethnic alliances, profit-first strategies, networks over kings. Luciano demonstrated that criminal power was not strongest when concentrated, but when distributed, shared, and made stable. Myth versus man. The two Lucianos that history remembers. Over time, two different versions of Luciano emerged: the myth and the man. The myth: a mastermind who controlled everything, everywhere. A suave emperor of crime whose word crossed oceans. A figure both feared and admired, larger than the system he created. This Luciano was sculpted by newspapers, films, whispers, and nostalgia. He became a symbol, not a person, a shorthand for the dangerous charm of organized crime. The man, far more complex, far more contradictory. He was brilliant, yes, a strategist who understood structure and human nature better than his rivals. But he was also ruthless when necessary, opportunistic when cornered, and deeply ambitious. He could be diplomatic yet merciless, visionary yet pragmatic, charismatic yet calculating. He didn't set out to make the Mafia noble, he set out to make it efficient. He didn't dream of unity, he dreamed of profit and stability. He wasn't a hero of the underworld, he was its engineer. To call him simply a reformer is to ignore the violence he sanctioned. To call him merely a criminal is to ignore the brilliance he wielded. What made Luciano different? Many gangsters wanted power. Luciano wanted systems. Many wanted control. Luciano wanted coordination. Many ruled with intimidation. Luciano ruled with influence. This separation is why his legacy endured. Brutal men rise and fall. Architects leave structures that survive them. Luciano created a mafia that could outlast its leaders, could evolve, could adapt, because it was no longer dependent on a single man's charisma or violence. The irony of a lasting revolution. The greatest irony of Luciano's life was this: his reforms succeeded so completely that they made him unnecessary. The commission thrived without him. The five families reorganized without him. International rackets strengthened without him. The revolution he built did not die with his exile, it matured. He had created a political machine disguised as a criminal network, and like all machines, it continued operating even when its builder was removed. A quiet revolution still echoing today, whenever criminal networks cooperate instead of collide, whenever syndicates adopt business models instead of brute force, whenever gangs form councils rather than engage in endless street wars, Luciano's ideas ripple beneath the surface. His legacy is not in the crimes he committed, the violence he survived, or the empire he briefly led. His legacy is in the transformation he engineered, the restructuring of chaos into order. He did not shout. He did not grandstand. He changed the world of crime quietly, permanently. The final reflection: visionary or opportunist? Was Luciano a visionary? Yes, he saw a future none of his peers could imagine. Was he a ruthless opportunist? Absolutely, he seized every chance with a predator's instinct. Both truths coexist, inseparable. He was a product of poverty, violence, and ambition. Yet he reshaped those very forces into something larger than himself. He built a criminal architecture that continues to shape the underworld's evolution long after his death. Lucky Luciano's legacy lies not in his throne, but in the blueprint he left behind, a silent revolution whose echoes still shape shadows across the world.